They say the river ran black for 7 days, not with blood, not with oil, not with the filth of a dying city, with ink. The ink of 10,000 books, the ink of 500 years of thought, the ink of astronomers and poets and physicians and mathematicians and translators and dreamers who had spent their lives turning the invisible into words, and the words into pages, and the pages into the greatest library the world had ever known. The Mongols threw the books into the Tigris, and the river turned to ink. I know this because I was there. I was the one who carried them to the river. Not willingly. Not with my hands open. With my hands bleeding, and my back bent, and a Mongol soldier behind me with a sword that was still wet from the man who had refused before me. I carried the books to the river, and I put them in, and I watched the pages open on the water, like white birds trying to fly, and the ink bleeding out of them, and the current taking them, and the words dissolving, letter by letter, sentence by sentence, into the brown water of the Tigris. And the water turned black, and I stood on the bank, and I watched 500 years of civilization float away, and I did not die. And the not dying is the thing I have been trying to forgive myself for ever since. My name is Tariq. Tariq ibn Yusuf. I was a warok, a keeper of books, a copyist, a librarian in the Bait el-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. I want you to understand what that name means. Not a library, not a building with shelves. The House of Wisdom. A house where wisdom lived, where wisdom was fed and tended and argued with and challenged and copied and translated and sent out into the world the way a father sends out his sons, to travel, to teach, to come back changed. The House of Wisdom was founded by the Caliph al-Ma'mun 400 years before I was born. He had a dream. In the dream, Aristotle appeared to him, and Aristotle said, "What is good?" And the Caliph said, "What is good according to reason?" And Aristotle said, "Then seek reason." And the Caliph woke up, and he built a house for reason. And the house grew. It grew the way a garden grows, when the soil is rich and the water is constant, and the gardener is patient. It grew for 400 years. It absorbed the knowledge of Greece and Persia and India and China. It translated Plato and Galen and Euclid and Ptolemy. It invented algebra. It named the stars. It mapped the human body. It calculated the circumference of the earth to within a few miles of the truth. 500 years of thinking. All of it on paper. All of it in ink. All of it in my care. I was 43 years old. I had been in the House of Wisdom since I was 14. 29 years. My hands were stained with ink, the way a dyer's hands are stained with dye. The stains were permanent. They lived in the creases of my knuckles, in the lines of my palms, in the half-moons of my fingernails. Ink hands. A warwick's hands. The hands of a man who had spent his life touching words. I could read 6 languages: Arabic, Persian, Greek, Syriac, Sanskrit, and enough Latin to make a Frankish monk uncomfortable. I could copy a page of Quran in Naskh script, so clean and even that the letters looked printed. I could repair a binding. I could mix ink, the recipe I had learned from my master, who had learned it from his master. Lamp black and gum Arabic and water from the Tigris. The same water that would later carry the ink away. I lived among the books, not metaphorically, literally. My room was in the house, a small room on the 2nd floor, overlooking the courtyard where the scholars argued in the afternoons, and the fountain splashed, and the pigeons gathered on the rim of the basin and drank. I slept with the smell of paper and leather and old glue, the smell of knowledge, the particular dry, sweet, ancient smell of a library, which is the smell of 10,000 human minds pressed into pages and left to age. I loved that smell, the way the flower seller loved marigolds, the way the baker loved yeast, the way the nun loved the rope, the smell of the thing you are. There is a moment in the life of a keeper of books that no one tells you about. A moment when the book stops being an object and becomes a companion. I remember the first time it happened to me. I was 19. I had been given a manuscript to repair, a copy of Al-Kindi's treatise on optics. The binding was cracked. The pages were foxed with age. The ink on the third page had faded to a ghost. I held the book, and I felt it. Not the weight, not the leather, not the paper. The presence of the man who had written it, Al-Kindi, who had sat at a desk, perhaps in this very building, perhaps in this very room, 200 years before I was born, and had dipped his pen in ink and had thought about light, about how light moves, about why shadows have edges, about why the world is visible. He had thought, and the thought had traveled through his arm, into his hand, into the pen, into the ink, into the page, and the page had held it. For 200 years, the thought was still there, alive, waiting, patient as a seed in dry earth. I held the book, and the thought reached me, across 200 years, across the death of the man who thought it, across the cracked binding and the foxed pages and the faded ink. The thought reached me, and I understood, for the first time, what a library is. A library is not a building full of books. A library is a building full of people who are dead, but whose thoughts are still alive. A library is a room where the dead speak and the living listen. And the listening is a kind of love, and the love is a kind of duty, and the duty is a kind of prayer. I had a wife, Zahra. She lived in the city, not in the house. She lived in our home, in the quarter near the Mustansiriya, with our 2 sons, Yusuf and Hassan, who were 12 and 9. She came to the house sometimes, bringing food, because I forgot to eat. She would find me at my desk, bent over a page, my lamp burning low, and she would put a plate of bread and dates beside my elbow, and she would stand behind me, and she would read over my shoulder. She could read. I had taught her, against the custom, against the expectation. A warak who teaches his wife to read is a warak who has decided that knowledge is not a thing to be hoarded, but a thing to be given. I gave it to her, and she took it, the way she took everything I offered, hungrily, completely. With the appetite of a woman who had been told all her life that the books were not for her, and who had decided, quietly, firmly, in the privacy of her own mind, that the telling was wrong. She read everything, the poetry, the astronomy, the medicine, the mathematics. She read Al-Khwarizmi's algebra and asked questions I could not answer. She read Ibn Sina's canon and diagnosed our neighbor's fever before the physician arrived. She was smarter than me. I say that without shame. I say it with the pride of a man who has married above himself and knows it. Zahra, the flower, the bright one. Baghdad in the year 656 of the Hijra. I should tell you about Baghdad, because Baghdad was not a city. Baghdad was an idea. The idea that the world's knowledge could be gathered in one place, that the scholars of every nation and every faith could sit in the same courtyard and argue about the same questions and drink the same tea and look up at the same stars and say, what if? What if the earth moves? What if the blood circulates? What if the numbers have a pattern? What if the stars have names? What if? The most dangerous words in any language, more dangerous than any army. more dangerous than any sword. What if? Baghdad was the city of what if for 500 years. And then the Mongols came, and the question changed. The question became, what now? The city was old. Not old the way Rome is old, with its crumbling columns and its memories of empire. Old the way a river is old, flowing, changing, still alive. The round walls that Al-Mansur had built 500 years before were still standing, patched, repaired, reinforced with the accumulated labor of generations, but standing. Inside the walls, the city breathed. 500,000 people, maybe more. Muslims and Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and scholars from India and merchants from China and travelers from everywhere. The souks were full. The mosques were full. The madrasas were full. The bathhouses were full. The coffee houses were full. The coffee houses. I should tell you about the coffee houses, because the coffee houses were where Baghdad thought. Not in the mosques, not in the madrasas, in the coffee houses, where a man could sit with a cup of kahwa, bitter and black and hot, and listen to another man explain why Ptolemy was wrong about the orbit of Venus, and a third man would disagree, and a fourth would quote Aristotle, and a fifth would quote Al-Biruni, and the argument would go on for hours, and the coffee would get cold, and nobody would notice, because the argument was hotter than the coffee. That was Baghdad, the city of arguments, the city that believed, with the absolute certainty of 500 years of evidence, that an argument, properly conducted, was worth more than a sword. They were wrong, but they were beautifully wrong. And the beauty of the wrongness is the thing I mourn. I knew a man named Al-Tusi, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, an astronomer, a mathematician, a man whose mind moved through numbers the way a bird moves through air, without effort, without resistance, as though the numbers parted for him. He came to the House of Wisdom once, before the siege, before the rumors, in the years when Baghdad was still the center, and the center was still holding. He sat in the courtyard, by the fountain, and he talked. He talked about the stars, about the planets, about the problem of Ptolemy's model, which had the planets moving in perfect circles, when the planets, as any careful observer could see, didn't move in perfect circles. He talked about this the way other men talk about their children, with frustration, with love, with the particular obsession of a man who has found a problem he cannot solve and who cannot stop trying. I sat and listened. I did not understand the mathematics. I was a warak, not a mathematician. But I understood the passion, the way the numbers mattered to him, the way each equation was a question asked of the universe, and each answer led to another question, and the questions were infinite, and the infinity was the joy. He left Baghdad before the Mongols came. He went to the assassin's fortress, then to the Mongols themselves, then to Mariga, where Hulagu, the destroyer, the man who would burn our library, built him an observatory. An observatory. The man who burned the books built a house for the stars. I have thought about that many times. The contradiction, the impossibility of it. The man who threw 400,000 manuscripts into the Tigris and who built a telescope for the man who wanted to watch the planets. The destroyer and the builder, in the same person, the same hands. I do not understand it. I do not think I am meant to. The rumors came from the East. The rumors came from the East. They always came from the East, because the East was where the world ended. And the things that came from the end of the world were never good. The Mongols. We had heard the name for years, for decades. The way you hear about a distant storm, lightning over the mountains, thunder beyond the horizon. Something happening, somewhere far away. to someone else. The Mongols had taken Samarkand. The Mongols had taken Bukhara. The Mongols had taken Nishapur, and Merv, and Balkh, and every city between the edge of China and the edge of Persia. The Mongols had done things the travelers whispered about in the coffee houses, leaning close, their voices low, their eyes wide. Things that did not sound real. Things that sounded like the exaggerations of frightened men, the way fish grow in the memory and armies grow in the telling. But the things were real. The pyramids of skulls were real. The rivers of blood were real. The cities emptied and leveled and left as warnings, the way a hunter leaves a carcass at the edge of the forest to mark his territory. The Mongols, Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis, the brother of the great Khan, a man whose name meant, in the language of the Mongols, something like warrior or destroyer or the one who takes. He was coming. He had been told to come. By his brother, the great Khan, who sat in Karakoram and drew lines on maps and said, "Take this, and take this, and take this." And Hulagu took. He was coming to Baghdad. And Baghdad, the city of arguments, the city of what if, the city that believed a good debate was worth more than a sword. Baghdad did not believe he would come. The Caliph did not believe. Al-Mustarsim, the last of the Abbasids, the 37th Caliph, the commander of the faithful. He was not a warrior. He was not a scholar. He was not, by any measure I could see, a man suited to the times in which he found himself. He was a man who liked birds, pigeons. He kept pigeons on the roof of the palace. He bred them. He trained them. He spent hours watching them fly, their white wings against the blue sky, their bodies turning in the thermals above the city. While the Mongols were taking Persia, the Caliph was breeding pigeons. I do not say this with contempt. I say it with the particular sadness of a man who watched his ruler fail and understood the failure and could do nothing about it. The Caliph was not a bad man. He was a small man in a time that required a large one. He was a man of peace in a world that was bringing war. He was a man who looked at birds when he should have been looking at maps. His advisors told him, "The Mongols are coming." He said, "God will protect us." Baghdad has stood for 500 years. No army has ever breached these walls. God will protect us. God will protect us. The most dangerous sentence in any besieged city. More dangerous than the enemy. More dangerous than the hunger. Because the sentence replaces action with faith, and faith without action is a door left open. He left the door open. The city argued. That is what Baghdad did, even at the end, even with the Mongols a week away. The city argued, in the coffee houses, in the mosques, in the palace, in the streets. Some said fight, raise the army, man the walls, meet the Mongols on the plain, the way the Persians had met them, the way the Khwarezmians had met them. The Persians had been destroyed. The Khwarezmians had been erased. But we were Baghdad. We were the center. We were the city that had stood for 500 years, through the Buyids and the Seljuks and the Crusades and every other storm the world had sent. We were Baghdad. Some said negotiate, send an embassy, offer tribute, gold, silver, the promise of submission. The Mongols had accepted tribute from other cities. The cities that paid were spared. The cities that fought were emptied. The mathematics of survival. Pay or die. Some said pray. God will protect us. The Caliph is the successor of the Prophet. Peace be upon him. The city of the Caliphate cannot fall. God would not permit it. God will send a miracle. God didn't send a miracle. God sent 100,000 horsemen. And the city that had spent 500 years arguing about the nature of light and the orbit of Venus, and the properties of zero, could not agree on what to do when the darkness came. I went to Zahra. On the night the first riders were sighted on the eastern plain, the scouts, the advance guard, the eyes of the army that was still a week away, but whose eyes were already here, watching, measuring, counting. I went home, through the streets that were beginning to feel different, the way streets feel different before a storm, when the air changes and the dogs hide and the birds go silent. The streets of Baghdad were not silent yet, but they were quieter. The coffee houses were emptier. The souks were closing earlier. The faces of the men I passed were turned inward, the way faces turn inward when the mind is doing calculations it does not want to share. I went home. Zahra was in the kitchen, cooking, the smell of lamb and cumin and the bread that she baked every evening. Flat bread, thin, the kind you tear with your hands and dip in the stew. She looked at me. She did not ask. She looked at my face, and she read it the way she read a manuscript. Quickly, completely, without needing to be told where the important passages were. She put down the bread. She wiped her hands. She said, "How long?" "A week, maybe less." "The boys?" "I do not know." "The books?" That was Zahra. The books came after the boys, but before everything else. "I do not know," I said again. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We should hide the ones that matter." I looked at her. "There are 400,000 manuscripts in the House of Wisdom," I said. "Which ones matter?" She looked at me the way she always looked at me when I said something foolish. "All of them matter, Tariq, but we cannot save all of them. So we save the ones we can carry, and we choose carefully, and we choose now." She was right. She was always right. I went back to the house that night. I walked through the halls. I want to tell you what the House of Wisdom looked like at night, because the night was when it was most itself. In the day, the house was busy. Scholars arguing, students copying, translators bending over texts, their lips moving, finding the Arabic word for a Greek thought. The sound of voices and quills, and the occasional crash of a shelf giving way under the weight of too many books, which happened more often than you would think. But at night, the house was quiet. The lamps burned low. The shelves cast long shadows on the tiled floors. The manuscripts, in their leather bindings, in their wooden boxes, on their cedar shelves, sat in the dark and held their silence. 40 years of the world's thinking. 400,000 manuscripts, the collected output of 500 years of the human mind, at its most curious, most ambitious, most determined to understand the world and write the understanding down. Sitting in the dark, waiting, not knowing that the waiting was almost over. I walked the halls. I touched the shelves. I said the names. Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra. His manuscripts were on the third shelf, second hall, eastern wing. I had copied 3 of them myself. I knew the shape of his numbers, the way I knew the shape of my own handwriting. Ibn al-Haytham, the father of optics, the man who proved that light enters the eye, not the other way around. His book of optics was in the locked cabinet because the binding was fragile and the illustrations were irreplaceable. Al-Biruni, the man who measured the earth, who calculated the distance to the center of the planet using a mountain and a piece of mathematics so elegant that it made me weep the first time I read it. Al-Razi, the physician who described smallpox for the first time, whose clinical observations were so precise, so careful, so respectful of the patient, that a doctor reading them 700 years later would still learn something. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was the most important medical text in the world and would remain so for 500 years after his death. Their books were here, in this building, on these shelves, in the dark, and the Mongols were a week away. I began to choose. This is the cruelest task a keeper of books can face. Not the copying, not the cataloging, not the repairing of bindings or the mixing of ink. The choosing. Which books live? Which books die? I stood in the hall with a lamp in one hand and the weight of 500 years on the other, and I chose the algebra. Because the numbers are the language of the universe, and if the language dies, the universe becomes mute. The optics. Because understanding how light works is understanding how seeing works, and a world that cannot see is a world that walks in darkness. The medicine. Because people will always be sick, and the knowledge of how to heal them is the most practical form of love. The astronomy. Because the stars do not care about armies, and the stars will still be there when the armies are dust, and someone will need to know their names. I chose. I wrapped them in oilcloth, the way the nuns in Paris had wrapped their manuscripts, the way Bertha had dug them up in the rain. The same gesture, the same desperation, the same fragile hope that the oilcloth will hold, and the earth will hold, and the words will survive the fire. I carried them home, to Zara, to the house near the Mustan Syria. I carried them through the streets at night, a dozen at a time, wrapped in cloth and hidden under my cloak, moving through the dark like a thief. I was a thief. I was stealing from the house of wisdom. I was stealing the knowledge that belonged to the world and hiding it in my house, in a hole in the floor that Zara had dug with her own hands, under the kitchen, under the bread oven, in the earth that smelled of cumin and ash. Every night for a week, every night I walked the same route, from the house to the home, through the dark streets, past the shuttered windows, past the mosque where the muezzin's call had become shorter, quieter, as though even the voice of God was conserving its energy. I walked with books under my cloak, and the books were heavy, not with paper, with thought, with the accumulated weight of 500 years of human beings trying to understand the world they lived in. The weight of questions asked, and answers found, and questions asked again. The weight of all the what-ifs that had ever been whispered in the coffee houses and argued in the courtyards and written on the pages I was carrying. The books were heavy with what-if, and the streets were dark, and the Mongols were getting closer, and I walked, night after night, like a man carrying water from a river that is about to dry up, one bucket at a time, knowing the river is vast, knowing the bucket is small, knowing the math does not work. Carrying anyway, because carrying is the thing. Carrying is the prayer. Carrying is the last act of a man who cannot save the river, but who can save one bucket, and who believes, with the stubborn faith of a Warak, that one bucket is not nothing. One bucket of the river is still the river. One book from the library is still the library. Zara received them. Every night. She was waiting. At the door that she kept closed, always. Except now. Now she opened it a crack when she heard my footsteps, and the crack of light from the lamp inside fell across the threshold, like a golden thread. She took the books from my arms. She unwrapped them. She examined them, quickly, by lamplight, checking for damage, for dampness, for any sign that the journey had harmed them. And then she wrapped them again, in oilcloth, the way nuns wrap manuscripts, the way mothers wrap children, and she lowered them into the hole, and the earth received them. And Zara covered the hole with a board, and covered the board with a rug, and covered the rug with a sack of flour, and the manuscripts were hidden under the kitchen, under the bread oven, under the ordinary floor of an ordinary house, where an ordinary woman made extraordinary choices. I stole perhaps 200 manuscripts out of 400,000. 200, the mathematics of rescue. The terrible, insufficient, heartbreaking mathematics of a man who can carry only what his arms can hold in a world that is about to burn 400,000 things. The Mongols arrived on the 29th of Muharram, January, the dead of winter. The sky was gray. The wind came from the northeast, cold, carrying the smell of horses and leather, and the particular metallic smell that large armies carry with them. The smell of iron and sweat, and the accumulated exhalation of 100,000 men. 100,000. Some say more. Some say 200,000. The numbers do not matter. What matters is this: there were more of them than there were of us. Many more. They surrounded the city. They came from the east, and the north, and the south. They crossed the Tigris upstream and came from the west. They surrounded us the way water surrounds an island. Completely. Patiently. Without gaps. And then they began. Not with an attack. With engineering. The Mongols were engineers. I want you to understand this. They were not the mindless barbarians that the stories make them. They were engineers. They built siege engines. They diverted rivers. They constructed earthworks and trenches and platforms with the methodical precision of men who had besieged 100 cities and had reduced the art of destruction to a science. They built. While we watched from the walls, while the Caliph fed his pigeons, while the generals argued, while the imams prayed, the Mongols built. The bombardment began on the 1st of Safar. Catapults, mangonels, the great throwing engines that hurled stones, the size of a man, over the walls and into the city. The sound. I have heard the cannons of Constantinople described. I have heard the guns of Hiroshima described. I have heard every terrible sound that man has made in the name of destruction. The sound of a stone the size of a man hitting a building is not like those sounds. It is softer. It is the sound of something heavy landing on something fragile. A wet, crushing, collapsing sound. The sound of mud and brick and timber giving way. The sound of a house becoming rubble. The sound of a room becoming a pile. And then the screaming. Because inside the house was a family. And inside, the family were children. And the children were not in the catapult's calculations. The catapults did not calculate. The catapults just threw. The first stone hit a house near the eastern wall. I heard it from the house of wisdom. A distant crash, muffled by distance and by the walls of the building, but distinct. The sound of something very heavy landing on something very fragile. And then a pause. And then the second stone. And then the third. And then the counting stopped, because the stones were coming too fast to count, and the counting was replaced by a continuous sound, a rolling, crashing, unbroken sound, the sound of a city being pelted by its own earth, because the stones were not brought from far away. The Mongols dug them from the fields outside the walls. They threw Baghdad at Baghdad. They used the land to break the city that had been built on it. The land turned against us. The sky turned against us. The stones fell from above, like a parody of rain. And the city, that had prayed for rain all summer, got stones instead. People moved underground, into cellars, into crypts, into the tunnels beneath the mosques and the madrasas, into any space that had a ceiling thick enough to stop a stone the size of a man. We became moles, burrowing creatures, creatures of the dark, the scholars of the House of Wisdom, who had spent their lives looking up at the stars, now looked up at ceilings and prayed the ceilings would hold. The irony was not lost on me. Men who had calculated the distance to the sun were now calculating the thickness of a roof. Men who had named the stars were now counting stones. The walls held for 4 days. 4 days of bombardment. 4 days of stones falling from the sky. 4 days of the particular horror of a city under siege, which is not the horror of battle, not the horror of men facing men with swords, but the horror of waiting, of standing behind a wall and listening to the wall being hit and wondering if this hit will be the one. The walls held, and then they did not. The eastern wall broke on the 5th of Safar. A section, perhaps 50 yards wide, collapsed inward. The stones and the mud and the timber falling into the city in a cloud of dust that rose above the rooftops and hung there, brown and thick, like the smoke of a fire that has not yet started. The gap, the wound, the same wound that had been in the walls of Constantinople, the same gap that had been in the walls of Masada, the same breach that every besieged city eventually suffers, because walls are strong, but patience is stronger, and the Mongols had more patience than any army in the history of the world. The gap opened, and the Mongols poured through. I was in the House of Wisdom when the wall fell. I felt it, through the floor, through the stone, a tremor, like the tremor in Constantinople, like the cup of wine shivering on the table. The building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. A manuscript, balanced on the edge of a shelf, toppled and hit the floor with a sound like a hand clapping. I picked it up. I picked up the manuscript. While the wall was falling and the Mongols were pouring through the gap and the city was dying around me, I picked up a manuscript that had fallen from a shelf. Because that is what a Waruk does. A Waruk picks up books, even at the end. Especially at the end. The killing lasted for a week. I will not describe the killing. I have described sieges. I have described plagues. I have described fires and floods and the falling of cities. I will not describe this, because the killing of Baghdad was not a siege. It was not a battle. It was not a thing that happened between two armies. It was an emptying. The Mongols emptied the city, systematically, methodically, quarter by quarter, street by street, house by house. They emptied it of people. I will leave the rest to your imagination. And I will hope that your imagination is not good enough to fill in the details, because the details are the thing that breaks you, not the scale. The scale is too large to feel. You cannot feel 1,000,000 deaths. You can only feel one. And one is enough. I will tell you one thing, one detail, one moment from the week of killing. I was in the House of Wisdom, hiding, in the back, in the manuscript vault, behind the locked doors that had once protected the most valuable texts from theft, and that now protected nothing. Because the men who were coming did not care about locks, and the texts they were coming for were not valuable to them. They were paper. Paper burns. I heard them enter the building, the sound of boots on tile, the sound of men moving through a library the way men move through a forest they intend to clear, without reverence, without pause, with the efficient, systematic motion of workers doing a job. They came through the halls. I heard shelves being overturned. I heard the sound of wood breaking. I heard the sound of pages being torn, which is a sound I cannot describe to you, because the sound of a page being torn is not a loud sound. It is a whisper. It is the quietest violence in the world. It is the sound of a thought being killed. They tore the pages. Not all of them. Not every page. They were looking for gold, for jeweled bindings, for the illuminated manuscripts with their gold leaf and their lapis lazuli borders. The ones that had value in the way that the Mongols understood value, which was the weight of the metal, not the weight of the thought. They took the gold. They left the thoughts. And then they carried the thoughts to the river. Because a library, once looted of its gold, is just paper. And paper, to a man who cannot read it, is nothing. And nothing in a conquered city goes into the river. The way the dead go into the river. The way everything that is no longer useful goes into the river. The river is the grave of the useless. And the books, to the Mongols, were useless. I hid. I am not proud of this. A braver man would have stood, would have said, "These books are mine. These books are the world's. You cannot take them. You cannot burn them. You cannot throw them into the river." A braver man would have died for the books. I hid, behind the locked door, in the manuscript vault, in the dark, among the empty shelves, the shelves that I had emptied myself over the past week, carrying the most important texts home, carrying them to the hole in the kitchen floor. The shelves were empty, and I was alive. And the books I had not been able to save were being carried to the river. And I was alive. And the living is the shame. Zahra. I need to tell you about Zahra. I went home, through the streets, through the smoke, through the sounds that I will not describe. I went home. The door was open. That was the first thing. The door was open. And Zahra was a woman who closed doors. Always. Even in summer. A closed door was her order in the world, her boundary, her line between the inside and the outside, between the family and the everything else. The door was open. I stepped through. She was in the kitchen, on the floor, near the bread oven, near the hole in the floor where the manuscripts were buried. She was lying on the floor, and the boys were not there. And the house was quiet, and the bread was burning in the oven. And the smell of the burning bread was the thing that broke me. Not the silence, not the open door, not the body on the floor. The bread. The burning bread. Because the bread meant she had been cooking. She had been making dinner. She had been doing the ordinary, daily, unremarkable thing that she did every evening. And the evening had been interrupted, and the bread was still in the oven, and the oven did not know that the world had changed. The oven just baked. The way the river just flows. The way the flowers just bloom. The way the bell just rings. The oven did not know. I knelt beside her. I will not tell you what I found. I will tell you that I said her name. Zahra. The flower. The bright one. I said it into the silence of the kitchen, and the silence took it. The way the sea took the woman in the hold. The way the tigress would take the books. The silence took her name, and gave me nothing back. The boys. I need to tell you about the boys. I found them. Not in the house, not in the street, in the mosque. The small mosque at the corner of our quarter. They were inside, with perhaps 40 other people, women and children mostly, huddled together in the prayer hall, behind the mihrab, in the dark. A neighbor had taken them. When the soldiers came to the quarter, when the doors were being opened. A neighbor, whose name was Fatima, had grabbed my boys and run, and she had brought them to the mosque, because the mosque was the house of God, and God's house was supposed to be safe. It was not safe. Nothing was safe. But the Mongols had not reached this mosque yet. Not yet. The quarter was at the edge of the city, near the southern wall, and the emptying was proceeding from the center outward, and the edge was last. I found them. Yusuf, 12, holding his brother. The way Cassia had held Livia. The way every older child holds a younger child when the world has become a thing the younger child cannot understand. Hassan. 9, his face buried in his brother's shoulder. Not crying, past crying. I knelt. I took them both, and I held them. The way the man in Pompeii held his family. The way the mother in Hiroshima held her child. The way every parent in every dying city holds the thing they love. Not with strength, with arms. Only arms. And the arms were enough, for now. I did not go back for the manuscripts. I want you to know this. I want you to judge me for it, or forgive me for it, or simply hold it the way I have held it for the rest of my life. The manuscripts were in the hole in the kitchen floor. 200 manuscripts. Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn al-Haytham, Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, the algebra and the optics, and the medicine and the astronomy. They were in the hole, and Zara was on the floor above them, and my boys were in the mosque, and the Mongols were in the streets. And I chose the boys. I chose the living over the written, the breathing over the bound, the small hands over the great thoughts. I chose my sons over the knowledge of the world, and I would choose them again, and again, and again. But the choosing is the wound. The choosing is the thing that does not heal, because both sides of the choice were right, and both sides were wrong. And there is no mathematics for that, no algebra, no formula that balances a child against a book and tells you which one weighs more. They both weigh everything. We left Baghdad on the 7th day, through the southern gate, in a column of survivors, women, children, old men. The ones the Mongols had decided to spare, not from mercy, but from the particular Mongol calculation that a living population is more useful than a dead one if the living population can be taxed. We were being spared for profit. The mathematics again, always the mathematics. We walked south, along the river, the Tigris, the river that had been the blood of Baghdad for 500 years, the river that had carried the boats and the commerce and the water that filled the fountains and the ink that filled the pens, the river that was now carrying the books. I saw them. In the water. As we walked along the bank, I saw the pages, white against the brown water, open, floating. The Arabic script still visible on some of them, the letters running, the ink dissolving, the words coming apart the way a body comes apart when the thing that held it together lets go. I saw a page of Al-Khwarizmi float past. I recognized the numbers, the notation, the particular way he formed his zeros, round and open, like small mouths. The page floated past me, and I watched it go, and I didn't reach for it, because my hands were full. My hands were holding my sons. The river ran black for 7 days. That is what they told us. The survivors who stayed longer, the travelers who came later, the historians who wrote it down, carefully, precisely, in manuscripts that would themselves be copied and carried, and hidden, and lost, and found again. The way manuscripts are, the way knowledge is, persistent, stubborn, refusing to disappear entirely, even when the library that held it has been burned, and the river that flowed past it has been turned to ink. 7 days. The river ran black for 7 days. I have thought about those 7 days many times. 7 days. The same number it took God to make the world. 7 days to unmake the knowledge of the world. A symmetry that the mathematicians in the House of Wisdom would have appreciated if the mathematicians had not been dead, and the house had not been burning, and the appreciation had not required the kind of distance that only time and grief and the slow work of memory can provide. 7 days. The fishermen downstream said the fish tasted of ink for a month. The farmers said the irrigation water stained the roots of the date palms. The women washing clothes at the riverbank said the water would not come clean, that the cloth they washed came out darker than when it went in. The ink was in the river. The river was in the fields. The fields were in the bread. The bread was in the body. And the body carried the knowledge of 500 years in the water of its cells, in the minerals of its bones, in the iron of its blood. We ate the library. We drank the library. We became the library. Not in the way we had intended, not through reading, not through study, not through the careful, patient, reverent process of a scholar bent over a page. Through dissolution, through the river, through the oldest form of knowledge transfer in the world, which is not the book and not the word, but the water that carries everything, the water that forgets nothing, the water that turns to ink and then turns back to water and carries the ink inside it, invisibly, permanently, the way a mother carries her children, even after they are gone. And on the 8th day, the water cleared, and the ink was gone, and the books were gone, and the house of wisdom was a ruin, and Baghdad was a grave, and the caliph was dead. Rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, they said, because Mongol custom forbade the spilling of royal blood on the earth, and so the earth was protected, and the caliph was not. The carpet, the pigeons, the open door, the burning bread, the river of ink, the end, but not the end, because I had 2 boys, and I had 2 hands, and the hands were stained with ink, and the ink was in the skin, and the skin was alive, and the alive hands could write. We went to Damascus, then to Cairo. We walked for weeks. Yusuf on one side, Hassan on the other, 3 people in a line, walking south. The desert was wide. The sun was white. The road was full of others who were also walking, also fleeing, also carrying what they could save. Some carried gold. Some carried cloth. I carried nothing. I had left the manuscripts in the hole. I had chosen the boys over the books. I had my hands and my memory, and the ink stains, and 2 sons who were alive. That was my library now. 2 living, breathing, walking books. Cairo received us the way cities receive refugees, with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I found work in a madrasa, copying manuscripts, because that is what a warak does. I copied the fragments that other waraks had saved, the pieces carried out of Baghdad by other thieves, other book runners. The fragments arrived in Cairo like scattered bones. No single fragment was the whole, but together, arranged, assembled, the fragments began to form shapes. Texts, books, a library in pieces, a library reassembled by refugees. I copied for 20 years, until my eyes grew weak and my hands grew stiff, and the copies went out. To Cordoba, to Toledo, where translators turned Arabic into Latin, where the what-ifs of the Islamic world became the what-ifs of the Christian world. The copies traveled, the way the laylek traveled, the way the flowers traveled, the way the songs traveled from the hold of the slave ship. The knowledge traveled, and the traveling was the surviving, and the surviving was the victory. Not a loud victory, a quiet one. The victory of a whispered word, passed from mouth to mouth across centuries. The whisper survives the fire, always. Then to the places where the knowledge had gone before us, carried by other hands, other waraks, other thieves who had stolen books from the fire and hidden them in holes in kitchen floors and carried them under cloaks through dark streets. The knowledge scattered, like seeds, like the seeds the flower seller spoke of. seeds that travel in the wind, in the fur of animals, in the pockets of children. The knowledge scattered, and where it landed, it grew. In Cairo, the manuscripts were copied. In Damascus, they were studied. In Cordoba, they were translated into Latin. In Toledo, they were translated again. And the translations traveled north into the cold countries, into the universities that were beginning to grow in Paris and Oxford and Bologna. And the algebra of al-Khwarizmi became the algebra of Europe. And the optics of Ibn al-Haytham became the optics of the Renaissance. And the medicine of Ibn Sina became the medicine of the universities. And the stars that al-Biruni had named kept their Arabic names: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Altair. The stars kept their names, because names are the last thing to die, because names survive the river. I am old now. I live in Cairo, in a small room above a bookshop. The bookshop is run by my son Yusuf, who became a warak like me, who has ink-stained hands like mine, who copies manuscripts in Naskh script so clean, and even that the letters look printed. He is better than me. I say that with pride, the same pride I felt when Tommaso, the apothecary's son, corrected his father. The same pride every father feels when the son surpasses the teacher. The surpassing is not a loss, it is the point. The point of teaching is to be surpassed. The point of copying is to be improved upon. The point of carrying the bucket from the river is to fill a new river. Yusuf fills a new river. Every day, with his ink-stained hands, in his bookshop in Cairo. He copies, and the copies go out, and the river of knowledge flows again. Not from Baghdad, not from the Tigris, from a small shop in Cairo, where a man sits at a desk and dips a pen in ink and writes the words that another man wrote 500 years ago, in another city, in another world. The same words, the same ink, a different river. Hassan became a physician. He read Ibn Sina's canon, the copy that survived, the copy that someone else had hidden in some other hole, in some other kitchen, in some other city. He heals people with the knowledge that was written in Baghdad, copied in Cairo, carried by waraks, hidden by wives, buried under bread ovens. He heals people with buried knowledge. And every patient he saves is a book that survived the river. My boys, my living choices, the ones I chose over the books, they are alive. They are the books now. They are the library. Walking, breathing, copying, healing. The library on two legs. Zara, I say her name every night, before sleep, in the dark, in the small room above the bookshop, where the smell of paper and leather and old glue comes up through the floorboards. And the smell is the same smell, the same library smell, because libraries smell the same everywhere, in every century, in every city. The smell of 10,000 human minds, pressed into pages and left to age. Zara, the flower, the bright one, who taught herself to read, who diagnosed the neighbor's fever, who dug the hole in the kitchen floor with her own hands, who was making bread when the world ended, who did not close the door, because the door was opened from the outside. I dream about her sometimes. In the dream, she is reading, in the courtyard of the House of Wisdom, in the afternoon light. The fountain is splashing, the pigeons are drinking, and Zara is sitting on the stone bench with a manuscript in her lap, and she is reading, and her eyes are moving across the page, and her lips are moving slightly, sounding out the difficult words, the way she always did, the way every reader does when the text is dense, and the thought is large. In the dream, I stand in the doorway, and I watch her read, and I do not interrupt, because watching Zara read was the most beautiful thing I ever saw, more beautiful than the calligraphy, more beautiful than the illuminations, more beautiful than any manuscript in any library in any city. A woman reading. The most dangerous thing in the world. The most beautiful thing in the world. The same thing. I say their names, every night, in the dark. Zahra. My wife. The bright one. Who could read 6 languages and chose to read them all. Yusuf. My son, who became a warak, who carries the ink in his hands. Hassan. My son, who became a physician, who carries the healing in his hands. Al-Khwarizmi, whose zeros float in the Tigris. Ibn al-Haytham, whose light is still traveling. Al-Razi, whose patients are still being healed. Ibn Sina, whose canon is still being read. Al-Biruni, whose stars still have their names. The Caliph, who loved pigeons, who fed them on the roof, who did not see the storm because he was watching the birds. The house of wisdom. The house where wisdom lived. The house that was burned. The house that is gone. But the wisdom is not gone. The wisdom is in the copies, in the translations, in the students who read the translations, in the scholars who argued about the translations, in the scientists who built on the arguments, in the doctors who healed with the medicine, in the mathematicians who calculated with the algebra, in the astronomers who looked up at the stars and called them by their Arabic names. The house burned. The wisdom walked out, on 2 legs, in 2 arms, with ink-stained hands. The wisdom walked out of Baghdad, the way the bread walked out of Pompeii, the way the weaving walked out of Tenochtitlan, the way the singing walked out of the slave ship, the way the bells walked out of Paris. The wisdom walked, and the walking is the story, and the story is the wisdom, and the wisdom is still walking. They burned the house. They did not burn the light. The light is still here, in the copies, in the translations, in the numbers and the stars and the equations. In the bookshop in Cairo, where a man with ink-stained hands sits at a desk in the morning, before the sun, in the dark, and writes. The way I wrote, the way Al-Khwarizmi wrote, the way every warak, in every century, in every city, sits and writes. Because writing is the prayer, and the prayer is the preservation, and the preservation is the victory. The quiet, stubborn, ink-stained victory of a man who carries a bucket from a burning river. 1 book at a time, 1 word at a time, 1 letter at a time, until the river flows again. Remember us. Remember us. Remember us.